Hello, everyone. Welcome to LTR edition 19. This is our 19th ever LTR. Of course, you know, LTR stands for Love Technology Relationships, and this is where the Internet Dating Excellence Association's members gather to learn, share, and connect. And a couple of things, some housekeeping. We have a Q&A section to the right, so if you'd like to ask some questions, I do encourage you to ask questions. I'm going to pick off the top 3 questions to ask Geoff at the end of his presentation. And so we've got a general chat area, but if you've got a question, please put it into the question area, and then you can vote up the questions that you'd most like to have asked, and I'll ask them of Geoff at the end. So we are very privileged today to have Geoff Cook as our speaker. Geoff is the CEO and co-founder of the Meet Group, which you all know is a social dating and live streaming company. He's also co-CEO and GM of video for the parent company, ParshipMeet Group. Check out livebox.com. You've seen VPass before. VPass is now Livebox. It's been renamed, and you can now see the details at livebox.com, which serves dating apps like Plenty of Fish and social services like Kiki, and more recently, even Tumblr. That's a great win. So we have a special treat for you today because we've got a brand new, fresh presentation. Geoff has a new presentation for you, and this is named Do Things That Don't Scale, Then Scale Them. So without further ado, Geoff, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. So great to be here and good to see people. And if there's any issues with the presentation, just given I can't actually see everyone while in presenter mode, just Mark's going to come in and let me know. So I'm going to talk today about doing things that don't scale and then scaling them. So, there's this quote recently came across, always start with an Emerson quote, that I think applies nicely to running a startup. And Emerson said, if a man has good corn or wood or boards or pigs to sell, or can make better chairs or knives, crucibles or church organs than anybody else, you will find a broad, hard-beaten road to his house, though it be in the woods. Now, wouldn't that be nice if that were true? He obviously lived, 100 plus years before the iPhone, but the idea, still resonates, and it's often said in the form of, if you build a better mousetrap, people will find it, and your startup will take off, or your feature will take off. And typically, that's not how it actually happens. The reality is, building a better mousetrap is usually insufficient. It's not enough to be very good. There's a good TED talk, if you want to see it after this, Seth Godin. It's not enough to be very good. Very good is exactly where you are. Is the worst place to be. If you're very bad, you probably start doing something else. If you're very good, you're probably deluded to think that you could keep doing what you're doing, and eventually something will happen. And it's not enough to be very good. To get something from 0 to 1 typically requires something remarkable. And remarkable, of course, is an interesting word. It's something that you can remark upon. It often takes solving a problem that some people didn't even know exist, and certainly that others have not solved. Now, startups take off because typically the founders make them take off. Usually, it takes a bit of a push to get it going. Steve Jobs, of course, is well known for his relentlessness and his drive to bring new products to the market. And it often takes something that's something special about kind of the personality of the entrepreneur that leads to whatever that sequence of events is that allows the crossing of the chasm from 0 to 1. Famously, of course, Paul Graham said, the founder of Y Combinator said, do things that don't scale. And this is an essay that's now become, of course, part of startup lore, but it really captures the hustle mentality that I think founders really need in order to build a successful business. So what does it mean to do things that don't scale? Here's a list of some of the things that a startup must do in its early phases, from research and testing to launching an MVP, a minimum viable product, to testing and refining, getting evidence, validating and validating, and then ultimately, once you kind of have that momentum, to then to then go wide and big, and automate and implement kind of some of the processes you found along the way. So, a startup, there's various tactics, I think that many people have written about what are some things that don't scale. What does that mean to do things that don't scale? For one thing, it might mean recruiting users manually. In the case of Airbnb, the founders, of course, famously had to get their friends to list their homes or spare bedrooms on the website to help get the initial inventory. Facebook had to get its first users off the Harvard campus, the Facebook, of course. They had to get a critical mass in order to validate the engagement model, ultimately the business model, before opening up to the world. And this scrappy approach can be counterintuitive. It often seems maybe too small, like whatever that little narrow market is, maybe it's just not. It's hard to imagine how unlocking such a little market might lead to something bigger. But that's often how it's done. And for many startup founders, and often come from a tech background, it's not as elegant or as neat as writing code. Wish it were so, but it often is quite a bit messy to get a new feature off the ground, and it requires a bit of a different approach. And so often, do things that don't scale basically means you're going to do all of those things that you can't even really imagine. You're going to get your hands dirty. You're going to wear every hat, and you're going to really dissect the things that are working that aren't, in order to try to get that flywheel to start spinning. So today I'll share a little bit about how we use this philosophy at the Meet Group to roll out our successful live streaming product. And if you don't know about the Meet Group, I founded it a long time ago, in 2005. It's a social network for meeting new people, an app called Meet Me. We then later acquired and operate Tag, Scout, Lavu, and Growler. And then we built this fairly sizable live streaming video platform to power not only our owned and operated apps, but then to build a new business line that we call Livebox to power other dating apps and other social apps. Tumblr being the most recent addition, but we now power 3 of the top 4 public dating companies. So in 2015, the idea for that originally came about. I was on a trip to Asia, and I saw the success. I was in China. I saw the success that the Asian dating app companies had integrating live streaming into their own apps. And so this was more or less the beginning of live streaming in the world. And I thought, even though everything I saw was kind of in Chinese, I could intuitively feel that there was something different and special about that experience. And we all know that people come to dating or meeting apps to kind of connect with new people, but it's really that downtime between chatting one-on-one, say in a text message, where people can feel lonely. They can feel maybe even worse than when they originally opened up the app, and because people aren't connecting to them, even though they're trying to connect. And live streaming video essentially fills those moments of loneliness with kind of feelings of connection. And that's really what we've really always been about at the Meet Group. And so we wanted to build a live streaming platform where creators could entertain, where users could showcase their personality and find interesting people to meet. And if you're going to go down the path of live streaming video, you obviously have to confront safety right off the bat. We drew up a list of the things we'd need for a safety process prior to a launch: moderation resources, machine learning capabilities, safety and moderation standards and expertise, streamer management tools and processes, relationship building resources, um, connections to law enforcement and government agencies. And so we knew that every live stream had to be, essentially proactively moderated for the stream's duration. And as we kind of started down that pathway, you could imagine that it could be intimidating, right? Like that sounds impossible off the bat if you're sitting there, and as we were in 2016, saying, well, we were certainly well versed in moderation challenges of meeting apps, having run one for a long time. And we know that people will do the worst possible thing you can imagine that your technology allows them to do. And the question was, how could we stop that? And prior to the launch of it. And so, I think this is one of those kind of 0 to 1 moments where you kind of have to do things that don't scale, because in the early days, you don't have all of the ML capabilities, you don't have all of these processes built out, and yet you still need to launch. And so, how did you come about doing that? We certainly, we have millions of active users, and we were assuming, we would get 1 million minutes or so, or more even, of live streaming per day, right at the beginning, right at the launch, just given that we have a sizable user base. We also knew that failing at content moderation would have severe consequences, and maybe not just for the video portion of the app, which was new, but for the entire application. And certainly there's horror stories of enforcement, where an app store can remove you, and if you have inappropriate content. You could also face issues from advertisers or from payment processors who of course don't want to be associated with problematic content. And at the time, we were a NASDAQ listed company. And so, we certainly had shareholders who were also, certainly not interested in being part of investing in the distribution of adult content. So really having clean content was critical. And further complicating that period was, we were launching this fairly risky feature at a time when we were also battling short sellers for really survival. We were at the time one of the most shorted stocks on NASDAQ. And so these were, institutional investors betting against us. Live video was essentially a ready-made feature that let someone who's potentially adverse to you to spend hours on the app, create a 3-minute segment, professionally produce it of the 3 worst minutes you found in your many hours on the app, and then ship them off to some gatekeeper, ship them off to advertisers, and generally be disruptive to media and so forth. And we saw that. We actually saw we saw that attempt. And so it was really, we didn't want to just be clean. We wanted to be the cleanest you could possibly be, because we had very motivated, essentially enemies at the gate. And so safety was essentially an imperative, because of these short sellers that had $10 million short positions, and actually hired PR firms to try to put out negative narratives. And so we couldn't screw it up. We had to figure out moderation from day one. And so at the time we began developing our live streaming capability, the Meet Group essentially already had an experienced trust and safety team. We already had many tens of millions, nearly 100 million in annual revenue from other apps and from our advertising and other products. And so all of this, allowed us to start from a kind of a nice position. We were able to invest in safety, we had some resources to invest even further in safety. And so, we first launched live on the Meet Me app, and it was successful right from the start, in the sense that, it engaged users, deepened their time in the app. We were able to get, I think in the early days, 14-15% of users every day spending an extra 20 minutes. Even though we didn't have monetization, there was no real creator services. It was clear that there was something there. And so here's kind of the piece where we had to do things that don't scale. So we had to figure out a way to proactively moderate all of this live video, and so, we began by essentially taking screenshots of every video stream multiple times per minute, because we had already been pretty good at reviewing lots and lots of photo content for these dating apps. So we basically translated the video stream into something we could moderate, something we were already moderating, but in a different system. And so then we started reviewing, screenshots for appropriateness, and at the same time, kind of vastly scaling up an operation to essentially look at every stream. Certainly every stream that had any real traffic, as well as streams that showed changes in traffic. You can imagine if you're doing something unwanted, if you're violating our terms of service and our code of conduct, you could imagine that that's a pretty good way of attracting eyeballs, and therefore those streams are quickly growing in eyeballs. That might be the ones you most want to look at. So we essentially had the ability. We grew up the ability to more or less look at everything we could possibly imagine. And while there was a lot of content at the start, it's probably a tenth of what we have today. But it was still millions of minutes of content. And so, for the first couple of months, we essentially had hundreds of people essentially watching almost every stream, and then reviewing essentially millions of images. And using human moderators was of course not necessarily how you can scale this to 10x where that was. Human moderation is always going to have an important role, but we were essentially probably overly reliant at the beginning on human moderators. And of course, it wouldn't scale if you were to try to do that for 100%. The next step, of course, was to take this very human-centric approach to content moderation, and then find a way to scale it to our millions of users that we would come to power with live video. And we worked with our in-house. So we did have very small group at the time. So we had some ML capabilities, some machine learning capabilities in-house, but they were really looking for content that was really not related to live video or necessarily abuse. So we said, well, help us solve this problem. And we actually thought that we would end up taking, and we were hoping, frankly, that we would find something at the time, which is 2016, 17 at this point, that we would find a technology off the shelf, and that we would be able to apply that technology to our our screenshots, and it would magically work. And it turned out like none of the solutions out there, at least at that time, were very good at correctly assessing the presence of, let's say, risque content. And so we ended up having to train our own essential neural network, and ended up being dramatically better than some of the off-the-shelf items. And I think in part because we were using so many humans to tag things bad and not bad, we were able to benefit from a million human decisions in order to train an AI on exactly the types of content we actually receive. Whereas off-the-shelf image moderation tools are typically trained against some other set, and it might not be exactly a live video application use. And so, after 6 months, we're still obviously very, very reliant on humans at this point. But after a number of months of training and retraining different algorithms, it actually got very good. I read somebody, I can't remember who, but he said, the thing about AI is it doesn't work until it does, and then it's scary, right? So when you're training kind of a machine learning algorithm, or you're trying to see some improvements, and you're probably testing some engineered algorithm against some ML algorithm, you often find that the engineered algorithm is outperforming what you just spent all this time investing in, and that it takes months after that to really find to find a benefit. But then when you do, it can improve quite dramatically fast. And obviously, we live in a time where it's AI that's probably the most interesting thing going on in technology, with of course ChatGPT 3, and and soon to be 4. And so now we're capable of generating and analyzing actually 100 million samples per day. But if you were to go and say at the beginning when we were just launching this, well, all you got to do to launch is be able to review 100 million images every day. You would think that was something that would never scale. But of course, do things that don't scale. It may seem like you can't scale them, but over time, you'd be surprised at what you could scale. So some 95% of streams, of course, were abuse free, and the small percentage that did have some problem, we were ending. Over time, we even got better at dealing with the voice track, voice to text transcription, try to make sure that content was safe too. While also we spent quite a bit of time on age estimation, making sure that nobody under 18 is kind of sneaking into the app. And these tools were basically all critical to building the live streaming capability. I would say at the very beginning, age estimation, these were not the sorts of things we were really spending our time on. It was how to stop that most blatant problem, the nudity aspect. But over time, we were able to essentially create this vibrant live streaming ecosystem through kind of this careful commitment to safety. And so we did many things to kind of underscore this. We joined and participate actively in different collaborations, including with Spectrum Labs, including with IDEA, of course, the Internet Dating Excellence Association, and among others. And so, I think if there's a lesson in any of this for other founders, I think one is to think small before you think big. I think founders always want their companies to seem big. They end up copying, the flaws of other big companies, like being indifferent to individual users. But one advantage of being small is you can really hone in on a particular problem, and you can iterate so much faster than once you're kind of running a larger org. And so this kind of creative approach is essentially the startup primary advantage, the ability to easily and quickly pivot. And so whether it's acquiring users or kind of keeping them happy, always be racking your brains to think of new ways to kind of entertain, delight them. And then I'd say, another is, don't be afraid to, of course, to do things that don't scale. So it's easy to you could easily imagine a different reality where we think through all of the problems with running live streaming video for our audience, and we decide we shouldn't, because we decided to fix nudity to try to really optimize that didn't happen at the start. But you couldn't go down every aspect of age estimation, every aspect of every sort of abuse you could imagine right from the gate, right from the start, because you couldn't necessarily even anticipate what you were going to see. And so, doing things manually, and at kind of great human, kind of cost, might frighten some tech founders, but often it's how you end up starting out. And, it could mean over time, what's nice is that if you're in a growing space and you're seeing these opportunities, an ecosystem will start to form that solves many of the problems you have. So, today it probably would be the case that if we went off the shelf for a machine learning nudity detector, we'd find some much better results than we found in 2017. But in any event, we were able to solve it through technology. And so, as you identify these things that you might think you can't scale, you often find that you can scale them. It's often just a failure of imagination. It may have seemed crazy to think at the earliest days that we could sample a stream every 3 seconds and review it. But that's exactly what we ended up doing. And that's what we do today. Every 3 seconds, we're looking at the stream, obviously not with humans for the most part, but with sophisticated, constantly improving AI. And I think the arrow of certainly technological progress points towards automation and further scale. As I mentioned, you get this ecosystem of third-party tech that kind of just pops up and solves many of the problems you're dealing with. So you may think that you can't scale something, but as long as you can find the opportunities, as long as you can delight users, as long as you can engage and really ideally also monetize them, then these sorts of solutions will just start appearing. And of course, you need patience, discipline, imagination to get there. But if that's how you go, from having essentially a great idea to having something that can impact millions of people. And so with that, hope to take some questions. Okay, so hopefully people still see me. I see there's a bunch of items in the chat. Let's see if I can see if there's anything I should jump in on. Or Mark, if you have any that you'd like to. Looks like Mark's joining.
Locked out for a minute. All good. I think Irena had to turn on the permissions for me to come back. Let me put the light on here.
No worries.
So, yeah, we've got a couple of questions. So a couple of impressions. I just want to say thank you very much. That really gives us another perspective on innovation, and especially thinking about that awkward question a lot of VCs might ask at the beginning. It's like, how does this scale? It's like, when you start trying to do something which isn't apparently scalable, it's in some ways fits the mold of classic Clayton Christensen's disruption, right? You can't, the big boys can't see you coming because it doesn't look like you're doing something that's scalable, which is very good. So thank you for this wonderful way.
That's a good point. I mean, if you were doing something that clearly could work, they'd already be doing it. And that is often how, a lot of times startups will kind of go down a path that isn't leading anywhere, and then boom, it suddenly is. And because of all the effort that they are previously laid, they benefit from that. Startups can get into trouble when they, in the very earliest days, kind of blow up, but they haven't built all of the kind of stuff around it, and you might then just kind of be a flash in the pan.
And technology is projecting forward to see where technology will eventually enable something to become scalable is kind of the trick. And I guess that's what you really did with the live streaming. Is the big difficulty there was the safety aspect, which you've solved for now, but technology has met you. And made it cost effective to be able to do that and profitable. I've got a couple of quick surveys which I'm going to run to the group while we ask you questions. I'm going to ask them questions. So here's a question around, there we go, around AI, ML, if you'd like to answer that question. And I will look at the questions that we have for you, Geoff. So we've got a question here from Gina Levi, and she asked, was there a per hour, per person human moderation level? That is, one person would cover how many hours of streaming? So she's intrigued to know about the initial streaming when it was a manual process.
Repeat that one more time. I was actually responding in the chat to one of the questions. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Was there a per hour, per person human moderation level? I think you mentioned screening every 3 seconds. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we did scale up in India. So we basically in 2 locations in India scaled up hundreds of people. On a rate perspective, I don't recall what it was, but it was obviously much cheaper than in the US. I think the way we typically staffed it by queue. So we would say, like, this particular queue of, let's say, reported streams would have 5 or 6 people on it at all times, and this other queue of screenshots would have this many people, and then we would staff up or down in order to make sure our response times were low. In the beginning, I think we thought 5 minutes was reasonable. Now we aim for really under 60-second response time. So we're processing this in near real time.
Got it. Okay. So we can close the poll. We've got 45% of the people have answered yes, they're using AI, and 36% no, 18% not yet. And so I'll close that poll and throw another one up real quick. This is about ChatGPT going on stage now. Hopefully. There we go. This is ChatGPT 4. So imagine, if you will, several months down the road, there's a new and vastly improved version of ChatGPT. How do you feel about that? It's wonderful for the dating industry. It's terrible for the dating industry. Or ask me in a year. So, Geoff, I've got another question for you. This is from Brad Jones. He says, while the initial implementation with human eyes isn't scalable to your current state, having hundreds of moderators available at the outset to do it the hard way is still scaling with significant upfront capital investment. No? I think your answer to that is yes. It was a
Yes,
considerable investment.
it is a considerable investment, and I mentioned that, like, we were in the place where obviously we were launching this new product into an existing company that had the ability to make such investments. It wasn't as dramatic as you might think, because it was something that you could start with maybe 50 or 25 moderators and then quickly scale up, and it wasn't necessarily hire 500 employees in the United States, which would be totally different level of financial investment.
Gotcha. And we looks like we've got a lot of interest in this particular poll. I'll let it ride out a bit longer. I've got one more question for you, Geoff. This is from
Sure.
Marcy Rubin. What is the future for Livebox? What are you doing to become a Netflix? Well, it's not Netflix, but or is it?
Yeah, I think right now we're focused on adding additional partners. So we recently signed up Tumblr. I think that announcement was only a month ago or so. So you can find Tumblr Live now, right on Tumblr. And we now we work with 15 or 16 other apps. I would say that the sorts of things we're doing is kind of new engagement patterns. So we have something called battles and something called Next Date. We're looking for different formats that would engage users, and then we're always, because of course for our partners, always interested in other ways to monetize. We're looking into ads, we're looking to subscription, we're looking in ways beyond in-app purchase, which is the primary monetization method today.
Great, thank you, Geoff. And we've got the survey results. 42% of you think it's wonderful for the dating industry. 16% of you think it's terrible for the dating industry. And 42% asked me in a year.